plumbers and electricians might be the last to go. There's many, many other classes of jobs that will also be around for a while. Number one is if it requires licensure. So doctors, lawyers, electricians, better, faster, cheaper, safer. Whenever a machine surpasses humans on those 4 criteria, it generally becomes economically inevitable that whatever that task was, the machines now do it. I've heard it called the automation cliff. Automation rises, then also GDP and total economic output rises, which means that you can then afford to hire more people because there's more work to be done. But if we get robots that are able to build houses, you can actually reduce the cost of a house by 30 to 50%. But the thing is I actually still make more money now by focusing on teaching people meaning and teaching people writing and everything else. I make more money now than I ever did in my technology career.
Mindblowers, the mysteries of tomorrow. This episode, Post-Labor Economics with David Shapiro and Daniel Kafer.
David, it's great to see you.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
It's my pleasure. So what we're going to talk about here is post-labor economics. I feel that people are quite hesitant and they talk much more about like, how do we regulate? How do we stop this? It would be wonderful if we kind of could unpack how you look at post-labor economics and maybe take it a little bit step by step for people what you expect will happen in the near future and in a decade's time.
Excellent question and great way to start. So kind of the paradigm that I came up with that I've been thinking about and studying and talking about for the past couple of years is better, faster, cheaper, safer. So that's 4 characteristics or 4 criteria that if and when machines, and by machines I mean everything from engines and airplanes to robots and artificial intelligence, whenever a machine surpasses humans on those 4 criteria, it generally becomes economically inevitable that whatever that task was, the machines now do it. So here's an example. Why do we use cars and airplanes? It's because they're better and faster and cheaper than walking, right? That's why you use those machines. And in fact, airplanes are even safer. Per rider mile, there's fewer injuries, fewer deaths, because of how well regulated and how safe aircraft are. Now, that's not always true. There's been a few incidents with Boeing over the last few years, but that goes to what happens when regulations go bad and when companies optimize for the wrong things. Now, if we take that principle, that observation from the past, that better, faster, cheaper, and safer, that generally drives economic changes in terms of what we do and what we use, and also what tasks humans do versus what tasks we delegate off to machines, assembly lines and so on and so forth. If that trend continues, and if the other trends around, for instance, robotics and artificial intelligence continue, then one day, could be next year, could be 10 years from now. Some people still think it's 50 to 100 years away. Some people think it's never. But eventually what will happen is that cognitive labor and a lot of other kinds of labor that right now only humans can do, like plumbing and electrical work and particle physics, eventually it's possible that all of those tasks will be completely subsumed by AI and robotics. Now, of course, there's a lot of people that are super skeptical about this. There's also a lot of people that are very excited about this possibility. And then there are people that are afraid of that possibility. But based on historical trends, this is what's called the frontier of automation. So a economic researcher, Anton Koronek, wrote a blog post earlier this year, or maybe last year, that was entitled "The Frontier of Automation." And so basically what he did was looking at it from a first principles perspective, which is the sphere of automation is the totality of all tasks that machines can do or that automation can do and take it away from humans. And what he's basically saying is, as that frontier of automation expands, does the frontier of human capability also expand with it? Or will it be like, is it going to be a Venn diagram, or is the sphere of human capability going to be smaller and completely subsumed by the sphere of what machines can do? That is the big question. And so, yes, there's a lot of different possible reactions to this. There's also a lot of uncertainty.
It's actually really fun that you mentioned Anton Koronik. I was about to ask you whether you were familiar with his work. So one of the things I noticed he said was how this will actually impact people will depend on the level of investment. And I guess the not so intuitive conclusion is that the more you invest, the more capital you put into automation, the better it will actually be for humans, because then the growth will be so high, so they will earn more, and there will probably not be that much unemployment in the beginning.
Yeah, so this is a term, and I don't know what he called it, but I've heard it called the automation cliff, which is basically as automation rises, then also GDP and total economic output rises, which means that you can then afford to hire more people because there's more work to be done, because then the machines are not the bottleneck of productivity. So in other words, there's less waiting around for things to be done. And so then the humans are trying to keep up with the work that automation can do. But then where that ends, though, is what's called the automation cliff, which is there's more and more work for humans to do right up until the last minute that the sphere of automation or the frontier of automation then takes those last tasks that humans can do, and then humans are no longer a bottleneck at all. And there's a good reason to believe this, and there's a few principles to believe why this might ultimately come to pass. Number one, humans are slow. Humans are expensive to employ. Humans can also be wrong. So if you can get a human out of the loop, then it's often economically important to do so. Again, looking at assembly lines, we actually have what's called lights out factories today, which are factories that run with no human intervention whatsoever. The entire process, whatever it is that factory is manufacturing, is done on fully automated assembly lines with no humans. This is also safer for humans because machines are big and heavy and powerful, and if a human gets in the way, the human loses every time. So we have lots of evidence to look at. This is the direction that things are going. Now, we've seen plenty of jobs in the past get fully automated away. Telephone operators, assembly line workers are getting automated away, just as a couple of examples. So the question then is, what kinds of jobs can be fully automated? And I know that's not exactly the question that you're answering, but I did feel like it was important to add that concept of the automation cliff, and that things will be good up until everyone loses their job. And it's not going to happen all at once, by the way. So for instance, in the AI space, what we've already seen is that call center operators are actually kind of the first to go in a commercial place, where some companies have removed up to 90% of their call operators, and they're not being replaced by machines doing the same exact job. The actual need for that job is going away because of chatbots. So instead of calling into a company, all you need to do is go talk to its chatbot on its website, and then you don't even need to call in ever. So that's an example of how automation can completely obviate or subsume a human job or a set of human tasks.
Let's try to dive into the timeline a little bit here, because this is where I see people, they can't agree. I have seen people, posting articles saying it's happening, everybody's starting to lose their jobs already, even more sophisticated white-collar work. Others are saying nonsense, there's still more or less full employment in most of the Western world. Do you see this just about to happen, or do you think there's a few years before you really see the impact?
So as I mentioned, some jobs are already going away, and the people who are feeling it the most tend to be freelancers. So freelance graphic artists, they're losing contracts to AI tools like Midjourney and DALL-E. Freelance copywriters are losing their jobs to tools like Claude and ChatGPT. So it's already happening. And what I would personally anticipate is that you'd probably see, and this is typically called creative destruction, where new technologies or new economic paradigms create new jobs or new opportunities elsewhere while destroying older opportunities. So, for instance, we don't need to worry. Like horse grooming is not a job anymore that you're going to see posted on job boards all over. Why? Because most people don't use horses anymore. So instead, the job of horse groomer was replaced by auto mechanic. Fundamentally different work, even though it's still technically related to transportation. But that didn't happen all at once because the economy and jobs are broken into different sectors. There's different affordances and requirements in every different sector. So for instance, plumbers and electricians, which require licensure, they also require the ability to navigate a complex physical world and physical problems. Those will probably be some of the last jobs to go if I had to guess. But one of the rules of thumb that I have is if your job is entirely in front of a computer, you're going to be the first to go. So that's computer programmers, copywriters, marketers. And what we've seen, at least in anecdotes and some data, is that there are jobs drying up. And if the jobs have not yet been laid off, a lot of people in various departments, whether it's marketing departments or copywriting departments, have been put on notice that they are now expected to either dramatically increase their output with the help of AI, or that their department is going to be shuttered, at some point in the next year or two. Now, I did mention that plumbers and electricians might be the last to go. There's many, many other classes of jobs that will also be around for a while. Number one is if it requires licensure. So doctors, lawyers, electricians, anything that requires where the establishment, the status quo, assumes that only a human can do the job, and in order to do the job, you need a license to do it. Those are what I call statutory jobs, and they're going to stick around for a while. They might stick around forever. Who knows? At least until you can hire a robot plumber that's 10 times better and 10 times cheaper and 10 times faster than a human. But again, that's an if, and there's many people that are skeptical as to whether or not robotic technology and AI technology can get to that point. Now, in the meantime, if there is for classes of jobs that do not have statutory protection, it's basically just as soon as it's good enough, companies are going to make the rational choice of either outsourcing it to an AI provider company, or hiring someone to build the AI internally for them, or to build the robot to do it for them. So it's going to be staggered over time. Basically, again, as that frontier of automation expands into new domains, as it gets better at math, as it gets better at chemistry, physics, and so on and so forth, and then also as those technologies get integrated. But again, kind of one of the cardinal rules is if your job is done entirely on computer, that is AI's native space. So that means you're going to be more vulnerable. As far as when, it really depends on many other affordances that are required for doing that particular job.
Do you think we will see this in the unemployment numbers within the next 2-3 years? I do know that the unemployment in the US has risen a little bit, but it also seems it's because a lot of new people are coming into the workforce. So it may not be AI doing this, right?
Yeah, so there's a few numbers that I look at. And by the way, I'm not an expert economist. I'm still learning about economics, and I'm consulting with many economists for some of my upcoming projects. But unemployment rate is not the only metric to look at. Certainly that is a good start, but I also look at employment in terms of absolute numbers, because, as populations grow, as demographics change, you look at, say, I think America, last time I checked, has about 161 million people working right now. So you want to look at total employment numbers, and then you also want to look at labor force participation rate, which is the percentage of total citizens in the workforce. So in America, the labor force participation rate peaked in about, I think it was the late 90s or early 2000s at about 66%. And now it's at 61% and slowly declining. It might be going up and down just a tiny bit, but what I would anticipate and what I would pay attention to is people exiting the workforce permanently. So that's the NEET, the NEET. So not seeking education. Education, employment, or training. So as the number of people who check out of the economy for good goes up, that will not necessarily be reflected in unemployment data, depending on how unemployment data is collected in a given country or state. And so what I would anticipate is that as people, whether it is retirees, age out, and they're not replaced by younger people, because what we see, again, a lot of this is anecdotes, but particularly young men are less likely to enter the workforce at all. I think it was something like a third or almost half of Gen Z young men still live at home and don't work and have no intention of changing that. So those kinds of demographic trends are the things that I would pay attention to. And yes, to your point, if those numbers start to go up, if the total amount if the total size of the workforce of a nation starts to shrink, then that's generally a bad sign for that nation. India, for instance, is enjoying what's called a demographic dividend right now. That's kind of a colloquial term, but basically because they had such a huge population boom, India has a huge amount of young workers, which means they have more energy. They don't necessarily have families yet to feed, or if they do have families, that is a good motivation for them to be social climbers or to climb the corporate ladder. Whereas other nations like Japan and China, Japan has turned that corner a while ago, so their workforce is shrinking dramatically. Germany, Italy, a lot of nations, as people retire, there's nobody replacing them. And that was entirely due to demographics, not even artificial intelligence. So one of the things that I see is maybe we actually need AI and robotics to replace these shrinking working populations. Otherwise, the economies of these nations are really going to suffer a lot. And if you look at Japan, which their stock market peaked in the early 90s and has never really recovered, that's the future that a lot of nations have if they don't find a way to either increase workforce numbers or otherwise compensate for the lack of people working.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And you actually see demonstrations in countries like France, for example, where people are saying, how dare you raise the retirement age, because they actually they need the workers still. What does surprise me is it seems like AI is not even in the debate. I mean, at least not in Europe. It's not like we're saying, AI is coming to the rescue, because, like, for example, Germany, they have a terrible demographic situation with a lot of people exiting the workforce and nobody else coming in. And, of course, China even worse. And AI is actually, as I see it, coming to the rescue. But that you don't hear that dialogue. You don't hear a single politician anticipating AGI economics. Is that different in the US?
Yes and no. It's not the politicians as much, but it is private industry is pushing that narrative here in America. Particularly Silicon Valley, Google and Microsoft and Meta and everyone. That's kind of the narrative that they're pushing. And I do believe in that narrative, and I still get people ask me, they say like, Dave, are you worried about, population collapse or, those sorts of things? And I say, there's two big reasons that I'm not worried about it. And so number one is longevity, which I know you just interviewed Aubrey de Grey. So people will start to live longer, hopefully sooner rather than later. And then perhaps even if regenerative medicine takes off, then people that are older might be able to get their youth back and rejoin the workforce if necessary. And I'm not saying that that people should, work for someone else for centuries. I do think that everyone should get a chance to retire and enjoy life without working. But the combination of AI and robotics plus longevity, I'm not really worried about those problems in the long run. However, neither of those problems are solved yet. And I think this is why a lot of politicians don't talk about it, because you have to look at where your population is at. So where are your citizens? Because if you as a politician, just imagine, where the French citizens, the German citizens, and even many Americans, particularly from my audiences, they do not believe that the government will take care of them. They don't believe that the government should take care of them. They don't believe that the system will adapt in time. So they see this thing on the horizon where the coming wave of AI and robotics is going to destroy a lot of jobs. A lot of billionaires are going to get even wealthier. Meanwhile, they're not even going to be relevant anymore. So a lot of people are very afraid of becoming economically irrelevant in this case. So if you have a politician, imagine a senator or a president or a prime minister says, this is a good thing. We're going to set the economy on fire and none of you workers are even going to matter anymore. They're going to get voted out of office. So that would be basically political suicide. So no politician is going to admit that might be the plan, even if they're talking about it behind closed doors. And I don't mean that as a conspiracy theory. I'm just thinking about it from public relations and optics. How would that actually look? So I think that's probably the reason that nobody is talking about it one way or the other. It's just better to just wait and see. I know a lot of CEOs and a lot of politicians are in kind of that wait and see, like, okay, Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley in America is very, very noisy and is constantly making promises that they don't keep. Or not keeping promises. Sometimes they do the wrong thing. You look at how Facebook, turned out. Like, the promise was that it's going to connect the world, but it actually ended up dividing the world. So not only did it fail to fulfill its promise, it actually did a lot of harm in the meantime. So there's a lot of skepticism about the promises that Silicon Valley make. However, if you look at the trends, you look at the data, you look at the possibilities, it could be that it's not just the promises of companies, but you look at the direction of the research, you look at the direction of the investment, which you mentioned earlier. The amount of investment going into artificial intelligence and robotics is going up exponentially right now. So it remains to be seen, but that's kind of my perspective on why people may or may not be talking about this as a possible, coming to the rescue. I do think that that's coming, but the question is it 2 years out? Is it 5 years, 10, 15, 50? It seems like people are kind of settling on the 5 to 10 year time frame is when we should really start to see some of the power coming from robotics and artificial intelligence, at least in economic terms. Right now, AI and robotics has not really reshaped the economy at all, at least not in a big way. So this is all still, pie in the sky, hope and wishes.
Well, in some ways, I think it's easier to predict how it might look in 20 years than how it will actually play out. Again, the people I talk to who wants to regulate this, they're saying, I know how this will play out. Or at least they know what they fear, because they say, I will lose my job if they have some pretty well-paid, let's say, white-collar work that's quite repetitive. They say, so within 5 years, I'll lose my job. Nothing will be in place from the politicians, so let's say you will go from $100,000 to maybe there's a UBI, but then it's maybe a $20,000 UBI. That's a way the American population are thinking as well.
I think that's just I think that's a human reaction to change, because here's the thing. When you look at just human nature, and I'm not going to appeal to evolutionary biology or anything like that, but you look at human nature, change is often a threat. And so whenever you sense that change is coming, whether it's a change in the weather, a change in your neighborhood, whatever, it's either a threat or an opportunity. But more often than not, change is a threat. It means that the status quo that you're used to is going to go away. And that's what people are reacting to. Now, furthermore, there's a lot of historical evidence to support the idea that maybe this change is not going to be good, at least in the short term. You look at previous industrial revolutions, when 200 years ago, 250 years ago, vast majority of people were farmers. Fast forward 2 centuries, most people are not farmers. It completely reversed. It went from 98% people being farmers to 2% people being farmers, or about 90 to about 4 to 5%. It varies by nation. I think Scandinavian nations are still about 4 or 5% farmers. Anyways, point being is that now farming makes up a tiny percentage of work. But when you put it in statistical terms, that doesn't really mean anything. When you put it in human terms, what happened was entire ways of life went away. And that's really what people are afraid of. Now, would you want to go back and be a farmer? Do you want to go work with pigs and cows and, till the land? Some people do that for fun. Like, there's plenty of millionaires and billionaires who retire and buy a farm. But they're not doing it because they need the money. They're doing it because they enjoy that lifestyle and don't have any pressure to make ends meet doing that. But most people would not choose to go back to doing farming. So again, that's on a time scale of measured in decades and centuries, not how am I going to make ends meet for the next 5 years. So that's I want to validate a lot of that apprehension, because historically, yes, it's often really rough. What I will say, though, is that for people who make the transition early, so for people who read the tea leaves or read the writing on the wall and say, you know what, I see what's happening. So just imagine, you're a French farmer in, let's say, 1890, when tractors started kind of being talked about. I think they were deployed more widely after the First World War. So imagine you see mechanization is coming and you say, well, I'm going to get out early. So I'm going to sell my farm early and move to the city. That's kind of a trope here in America as well, particularly because, we have the huge amount of farmland. And so what happened is many people, either some tried to hang on and they sold their farm, much later, move to the city, get a new job, get an education, that sort of thing. So there is plenty that people can start doing today to start to prepare for this economic shift. Fortunately, it's not going to be quite the same as selling your farm and moving to the city, but I do anticipate that we're going to see as big of a change from, before AI and robotics and everything else to after. And that will be an entirely new economic paradigm, in the same way that we went from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy and now to a knowledge economy. We just have the mixed blessing, the silver lining of we're living through one of these transformational periods, which is interesting, but it's also challenging.
So if you should give, let's just say, a top 3 list of advice to people, let's just say they have a good white-collar job, privately employed, but they do kind of see the writing on the wall. They don't know if it's next year or in 3 years, but they don't think they'll be able to sustain it. It will be automated away. What would your advice be?
So number one, and this is not necessarily financial advice, but this is what I have always done, is number one, live way, way below your means. I have, for most of my working life now, I've made well over $40,000 a year, but my living expenses have never really exceeded $40,000 a year. And that means that you learn to be happy with less. And I'm not saying you should adopt a poverty mindset, but learning to get by with less, learning to save, that just leads to more financial security, period, end of story. I think everyone should do that if they're worried about money. So by having a longer runway, you're going to be a little bit better set for the future. Now, another thing that you can do is you can start to transition. So this is what I did. So let me just tell you my story. In 2019, when I started playing with GPT-2, 2020 GPT-3 came out, I knew this was the way of the future. This is the direction that everything is going. I started my YouTube channel. I started documenting all of my research. I wrote a couple of AI books because I said, I want to be part of artificial intelligence. I want to get out of old-fashioned information technology. I was a cloud engineer. So I was in technology and I said, this is old. I want to go to the new. And for people in technology, that's basically, adapt or die is kind of the mantra in technology. Your skills have a shelf life in technology. Whether it's a particular coding language or a particular platform. So we're just used to that, having to adapt with the times. And I said, AI is the next big thing. Now, after 4 or 5 years of being in AI, I realized, okay, this is actually just the beginning of something else. So then I transitioned again, and now I'm actually moving away from artificial intelligence, and I'm working more on philosophy, working more on meaning, working more on, for instance, this conversation, which is looking at the impact that it's going to have on humanity over the next 5, 10, 20 years. And by the way, I'm still someone who says, I want to lose my job to AI. One day, I will not do podcasts anymore because my advice, my opinions, my knowledge will be completely irrelevant compared to what artificial intelligence can do. But up until that point, I am now positioning myself to participate in ushering in that new age. So that's just one example of how I have made that pivot to prepare and I don't want to say exploit the change, but to make sure that I am participating in that change in a productive way.
Do you think for many people that will mean sacrifice? I was just thinking about Julia McCoy, who also told her story about like selling her very successful company and making, 10-20% of what she's doing. I'm doing the same thing, but mostly just because I want to. So I think for many people, they would say, yeah, but that's because you're in a privileged position. You can make that sacrifice. I cannot make that sacrifice. But do you see a kind of more smooth way? I mean, I guess everybody could save maybe 25% or something, but they cannot say, sure, I will earn 10% of what I did last year, right? That may not be an option.
It depends on how you define sacrifice. And let me provide some context. So my wife is following in my footsteps. She went to school, got a master's degree, literally just got into the workforce 2 years ago, just in time for all of this to happen. So now she's just like, why did I work so hard? And I'm sure there's probably plenty of people in your audience and plenty of people out there thinking the same thing. Why did I work so hard? And fortunately, she had her parents' help with college, so she doesn't have college debt, for which that is a huge, huge gift. And many people are worried about, college debt. And like you said earlier, if you have to sell your home, we already sold our house, by the way. So we already did that preemptively to move to where we want to be. So there's all these threats, right? Which like, okay, technology is going to change, work is going to change. And already she's working on following in my footsteps. And what we're doing is we're actually building a writing community. We're both sci-fi writers, fantasy writers. And what we perceive, what we think is going to happen is as people leave jobs that they do just for money, people are going to focus more on what they care about. And this is what I made an announcement at the time of recording just a week ago. Actually, I think it was a week to the day. I made the announcement I'm leaving AI. And one of the things that I'm doing is I'm going to be focusing on writing because I love writing. But the thing is I actually still make more money now by focusing on teaching people meaning and teaching people writing and everything else. I make more money now than I ever did in my technology career. So that's what I mean by change is often a threat, but it also can be an opportunity. If you double down on something that you love and you find a way to monetize that, you find a way to participate in what I call the meaning economy, you might actually end up doing better than, if you try and stick it out where you're at. Now, another thing is, if you do what you love and you have a good enough standard of living and you're not, slaving away at a desk working for someone else, is that really a sacrifice? I mean, I look at the way that I live today. I go for a walk in the woods. I go for a hike almost every morning. And yes, I don't make as much money as I could be making, but I have complete control over my time, over what I do on a daily basis, and I'm healthier than I've ever, well, not that I've ever been. I'm getting my health back from all the stress of working a corporate job. So again, I think it's a matter of framing, and I think it's a matter of if you measure your happiness strictly by the dollars you make, you're probably not doing it right. Is kind of how I would cap that off.
So let's try and jump a few years ahead. So I think one of the logical impacts that AI will make on society is some form of like either deflation or price collapse. Actually, I was inspired by this film with Matt Damon. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but where people become miniatures. They become like 20 centimeters. And a really nice house is not like $1 million now, it's like $20,000. And I was thinking, could AI in theory do the same? When I mention it, people think I'm insane. They're like, prices will always go up.
So technology is always deflationary, and with a big asterisk. So what I mean is you look at the cost of food. Over the last, again, 2 centuries, if you were, working class 2 centuries ago, you spent up to and sometimes more than 50% of your income on food. Now, even if you're working class, it's closer to 10, maybe 20% if you eat really well. Technology does generally drive down prices, and this is honestly the purpose of innovation and competition. This is one of the superpowers of free market capitalism, is that competition forces companies to try and provide goods and services at a cheaper price. Now, again, with a big asterisk that you can end up with price coordination and other ways that the game can be broken. But innovation does increase efficiency. Artificial intelligence and robotics could also dramatically increase efficiency. Now, it's not going to be universal across the board. So what do I mean by this? We're already seeing dramatic decreases in prices of some goods and services. Here's an example. My book that I just published, it's on the shelf behind me. When I started writing my book, this was before generative AI could make images. Played around making the book cover myself, and then I hired a professional artist, paid her $1,800 for cover art. It was good. I liked it. Then fast forward a couple of years, I'm done with my book and I'm ready to publish it. And then I go to market test different cover art. Well, now I have DALL-E and I have Midjourney and I have a bunch of other tools that I can use to say, okay, what do people actually like? What do people respond to? And I'm able to rapidly iterate without paying a human. It just takes a few seconds to make alternative versions of the cover art. And then once I find something that people like, then I do side-by-side testing. Do you like this original human-generated piece of work, or do you like the AI-generated work? And guess what? the market actually prefers AI-generated artwork over human-generated artwork, at least in the case of science fiction covers. Now, you look at the time. So this goes back to better, faster, cheaper, safer. I paid 2 human artists a total of over $2,500 to make cover art. It took them weeks and was very expensive. Midjourney costs $20 a month and takes seconds. Not only is it faster and cheaper, again, like I said, the market actually preferred AI-generated art, at least again in the context of science fiction. So it's better, faster, and cheaper. Well, what am I going to do? I'm just an individual hobbyist, right? I'm not trying to make millions of dollars on my books. I just want to publish a piece of art. So am I going to spend thousands of dollars on human artists, or am I going to spend $20 on Midjourney? So that's an example of enormously deflationary pressure where AI already exists. It's something like, I think it's 90 times cheaper and 10,000 times faster because it takes a few seconds rather than a few weeks. So we have these orders of magnitude change in terms of cost and time for some goods and services. Now, that's not going to be everything. So what I've been working on lately is taking a first principles approach. Where is it that human cognitive labor is a bottleneck? Because it's not a bottleneck everywhere. Look at auto manufacturing. Most of what goes into a car is done by machines. All the gigantic presses, all the assembly lines. Human brains are not the limiting factor there. So when you look at where is artificial intelligence going to really cause deflation, it's going to be in things that are purely informational, things that are purely service-based, things like customer service, law. There's lots of legal departments that are integrating artificial intelligence. So law services might get cheaper and those sorts of things. Digital entertainment. So video games could get a lot cheaper. Movies, music. There's actually a few YouTube channels that I listen to and artists on Spotify. All the music is AI generated. So now there's this huge possibility of creating a lot more digital goods for almost free. Now, that's not going to have direct impacts on the rest of the economy because, again, you look at how much something weighs. If something is heavy or energy expensive, those costs are not really going to change, at least not until maybe we invent fusion and energy becomes much cheaper. But it's always going to take time for trees to grow. It's always going to take time for ships to sail across the ocean. It's going to take time for trains to move around. So there's always going to be other constraints and other bottlenecks. But those are kind of the general principles that I use for assessing, like, where might costs come down? Going back to something more practical and immediate, houses. Houses are very expensive because there's a lot of materials that go into them. Artificial intelligence won't necessarily impact that directly. But if we get robots that are able to build houses, you can actually reduce the cost of a house by 30 to 50% if you're able to do it without human labor. Because again, humans are very slow and very expensive and prone to errors. So yes, the long story short is the combination of AI and robotics plus other downstream technologies, like if we implement more solar and figure out fusion and quantum computing. Again, those things haven't happened yet, but if they do, they could have many, many knock-on effects or what's called spillover effects on the rest of the economy. But yeah, so we'll see some things will become 1,000 times cheaper. Some things will become 20% cheaper. But that's kind of the pattern that I would expect to see moving forward.
So one of my theories about that is that humans might actually become a luxury good. Let's imagine a restaurant, for example. You could say that there could be restaurants with very little human input. You just get the food made by a robot, served by a robot. But then you might say, well, I actually kind of like the human interaction. So kind of the charming waiter who can create the unique experience that might be more expensive if you have something special to offer. And it could be other things where humans just prefer other humans, but it would be the luxury choice. Do you see it the same way?
Yeah, I do anticipate that there will be a durable demand for, I call it like a human premium, where people will be willing to pay extra for the privilege of having, human-based service. There's also probably going to be quite a few jobs where people will just always prefer humans. So like a priest, right? If you're religious, do you want a robot to give you ministrations? Probably not. You probably would prefer to get your meaning from a human. So like priests and philosophers, again, you go to a restaurant or you go to a bar or you go to a coffee shop. Do you want to, if you just want a quick coffee, you don't care if a robot serves you. But if you go to a really nice coffee shop where you're going to go read and hang out, you probably want a cute barista to serve you. Or if you go to a fancy restaurant, would you buy a wine if the sommelier was a robot? You probably wouldn't. You want to have a shared experience with other humans, because again, this is where I will bank on evolution, is because we're a social ape. So our brains, our biology, our evolution is finely calibrated to understand the body language from other humans, the facial expressions, and you actually get biochemical rewards from positive interactions with other humans. Now, it could be possible that one day in the far future, robots are good enough that you can't tell the difference, but that is like still science fiction. But in the meantime, imagine that you take your kid to daycare. Even if the daycare does have robots to help out, you probably don't want the robot touching your child. You'd probably prefer, human gentleness and that human empathy to help, to help take care of your child. Same thing for teachers. A teacher might use a robot assistant to help, hand out and grade things. But what really matters for a teacher, it's not just a matter of teaching facts and skills. It's about teaching communication skills and emotionally connecting with children. So there's a lot of cases where we can probably expect we will prefer humans forever. Even if machines could hypothetically do it better, just on the fact that we are humans, you probably want a human doing it. Now, if other people, imagine that you have every developer loses their job in 10 years, just as a hypothetical. You would then have a whole lot of people looking for work, which would drive down the wages of everyone else. So even if there are some of these other jobs to be done, it could be bad news, because if you have a glut of labor supply, that will drive down the price of that labor. So that's one thing where, while yes, I do think that there will always be some jobs around like that, I wouldn't anticipate them to be a major component of the economy.
I was actually thinking about some of your older videos. There was a point in time where you decided not to put your face on the video. You want kind of a new, more professional look. And if memory serves me correct, people didn't like that, right? They wanted to look at you talking. And I felt the same way. I'm like, why doesn't he show his face? And I think that's one of those factors that will continue somehow. I mean, sometimes an AI voice is actually nice. I mean, their English is certainly a lot better than mine, but it does seem that people prefer that kind of human touch.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, that's an example of what's called a parasocial relationship, which I think we already see this, right, with the rise of influencers and public figures, like you, like myself, like even Jordan Peterson and people. We actually, again, we have a very strong preference ideal preference is to interact in person, in physical space. Cameras and computer screens and microphones are not very natural, but seeing someone's face on screen is still at least good enough. You can see someone speaking on stage. You said that you're a keynote speaker, right? And it's like, what's the difference between you speaking on stage in person? Why is that actually more valuable than you just recording something that they can show them? It's the same information, right? It could even be better. You could have time to practice and it could be polished, but they still want you in person on stage, and they'll pay you a premium for that. So why is that? And that goes back to, it's just our evolution. It's just our biology. It's it's the way our brains work, is that we prefer those high value in-person interactions. So there will always be a premium for that. But again, not everyone wants to be up on stage speaking. That's a very particular skill. I haven't even done that yet.